And welcome to episode 18 of Watchtower in Focus, the show that zooms in on all things JW, bringing the governing body and its teachings and policies under microscopic scrutiny. The Dutch press is reporting that a few weeks ago, Watchtower's branch office at Emmen, the Netherlands, was raided by police along with 2 kingdom halls and 4 other properties linked with the organisation. To tell us more about this story, I'm delighted to welcome back Reclaimed Voices representative, Raymond Hinches. Raymond, thanks for joining us.
Okay, I'm a pleasure to be here.
And as you'll have seen, I'm also joined by my regular co-host, John Redwood, recently unveiled as Mark O'Donnell, and in place of the absent Covert Fade, a good friend of the show, Javier Ortiz. Mark and Javier, welcome.
Great to see you guys.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
So this is just a remarkable story, Raymond. You and the rest of Reclaimed Voices have been doing some incredible work in the Netherlands, raising awareness of child sex abuse. You've not just managed to get the attention of the media, you've also managed to get the attention of the Dutch Parliament, and an investigation, as I understand it, is pending. And then we hear this amazing story of a few weeks back, the Dutch police busting into the Bethel in Emmen and taking records. So what can you tell us?
Actually, a few weeks ago, I was informed by someone that a kingdom hall was raided in a place, and he asked me to keep this confidential. So I did it for about 10 days. And then I thought it would be great if we get some more information. So I asked Koen de Recht from RTL News Broadcasting if he was interested in this information, and sure he was. So I informed him about this raid on the Kingdom Hall, and he actually started to investigate the case, and he has his sources at the public prosecutor's office. And so he could tell me that actually there was not only a raid on this specific Kingdom Hall, but there had been a raid on the branch office in Emmen and also another Kingdom Hall, and 4 private houses. I assume that these are houses of elders who are keeping the archives in their private houses. And when I became aware of that, I was startled since I could not imagine that something like this actually happened in the Netherlands. And then when I was processing this information, we were actually becoming more at ease with it. That has actually happened since it was already known to us that Watchtower was not cooperating with some criminal investigations. They did claim clergy privilege, so elders did not talk. They were asked friendly to give information and handle over the S-77 forms and the notes that were taken. Sure, they did not do that. So a subpoena was issued to handle over the documents, and they still did not handle over the documents. So a raid on the Kingdom Hall and on the branch office was probably the only possibility and to get some information. I'm not sure what information is confiscated, if any information is confiscated, since the public prosecutor's office does not mention anything like this. But I have another source that is indicating that they are studying the information that they confiscated right now.
So, although we have no official word from the public prosecutor's office that there was any information extracted, you have reason to believe that there perhaps was information extracted, and it's just a case of them going through it.
Exactly.
Very interesting. Well, frankly, this is the sort of action that should be being taken in every country. You hear about this and you think, what is stopping the police in America, in the UK, and all these other countries, given how much we know about child sex abuse cover-up? Mark and Javi, I don't know whether you want to weigh in here. You just have to wonder, when is this going to happen in other countries?
Well, I was reading the was it RTL News article about it, and it's a rough translation from the original article. But even in the Netherlands, this is a big deal because according to the article, this has never happened with any other religious organization in that country. So it's a big deal there. And I think if I'm not mistaken, in the US, this has happened in other groups, right? I think Scientology was raided for their IRS issues back in the 80s or in the 70s. So this is not that uncommon here in the States, but it is in some of the European countries. But you're right. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if the authorities are willing to go that far here to get documents and evidence and really take these guys to court.
Raymond, I think it's worth mentioning that I think a lot of this is happening because over the past year, you and your group, Reclaimed Voices, has reached out to the public to invite any victims of child abuse to come forward. And we saw a very disproportionately high number of victims come forward. I think initially it was between 200 and 300 that came forward within a very short period of time. And then that triggered the media response. So we have your organization, we have media response, and the next thing is we have the police raiding the Kingdom Halls and elders' homes and the branch office itself. So I think maybe you can react to that, and perhaps we'll see more of this in other European countries and elsewhere if we have the same type of setup going on that you have in the Netherlands.
Yeah, I think that is really true what you are saying, since we are putting pressure on not only on the on Watchtower but also on the government to take action, since we had this high number of stories of survivors. We had the possibility to have attention from the media, but we also asked some of those survivors to consider reporting to the police, even if there's abuse happened 20 years ago or something like that. So actually 5 of them did actually that. They reported and they told their stories to the police. And there were also 4 other stories that we are not aware of that went to the police to file an official report. So there were 9 of those cases that are investigated in criminal investigation right now. And we had also a recent case that went to court, and in this specific case the Jehovah's Witnesses refused to handle over the documents that were asked for, and we raised attention to this by involving the media, but also asking some questions, asking the Dutch members of parliament to ask if it was truly the case that Jehovah's Witnesses in this specific case have really clergy privilege, and the Minister of Legal Protection in the Netherlands gave an answer that was indicating that it's maybe not the case that clergy privilege could be applied in this specific situation. We are also Reclaimed Voices started to do their own research, and this research is still carried out by Aswin at the moment, to get all the information on clergy privilege. When does it apply? What is exactly the Dutch law? What do experts say on clergy privilege? To put all this information together to get those cases even further in the near future. And we provided all the information that we have to the Dutch public prosecutor. We had a conversation with the Public Prosecutor's Office about this situation. We have a lawyer that analyzed Nico Meiring, that analyzed the policies, Watchtower's policies. So the letters, the Body of Elders letters, the Elders Manual, and wrote a whole letter of 12 pages to the Public Prosecutor's Office. And I think that all those information together came actually together in those cases to see that it is really important to get this information. And there was also another situation, and I was not aware of that as well, but in an appeal case that was done in Amsterdam, actually the judge got a document, and we don't know how it was done, but actually the document, the S77 form, was important to raise a verdict, since the perpetrator claimed only to have abused one victim, and he was sentenced for this one verdict, but in the appeal case, he was sentenced for abusing 3 victims, and the most important piece of evidence was this S77 form. So I think that the Dutch authorities became aware of the important information that is actually in these S77 forms, and that is the reason why they are now taking action to have access to the information in those 9 cases.
Just so viewers are aware, the S77 form is the form filled in by elders giving the reasons for fellowshipping. So you can imagine that these forms have a lot of significance when we're dealing with situations where someone has been disfellowshipped over child molestation, because these forms will have records of how much the elders knew about a case, which could be very incriminating if the case was never reported to the authorities. Raymond, I'm just interested to know where these Dutch raids fit in what's happening in the Netherlands at the moment. I was recently, just a few weeks back, with you in the Netherlands filming a documentary about the work of Reclaimed Voices, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more shortly. But it became clear that you're waiting for an investigation by the Dutch Parliament that's already been voted on. You recently told me in private conversation that you've had concerns over the remit of this investigation and whether it will be thorough enough. And as I understand it, you're currently satisfied that it will be a thorough investigation. Where do these raids fit in terms of the investigation? Is this a preemptive action for the investigation, or is this to do with cases that the prosecutor's office was already investigating?
No, this is specific for the criminal investigation of that the prosecutor, the public prosecutor is involved in. So for the specific 9 cases, and we have a second track, and that is the scientific investigation that will be done, that is initiated by the Dutch government, and we are waiting for a start document that will explain what the range of the investigation will be, what questions will be raised, and try to answer what parties will be involved in this situation. And we are expecting this document before Christmas, so within 2 weeks.
So these raids were more to do with action being taken by the public prosecutor's office, but presumably if there are any outstanding findings that are yielded by these raids, they would be useful in informing the future investigation.
Of course they will, and otherwise we will point to the information in this criminal investigation.
I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. Well, yeah, it was remarkable for me to be able to visit. And in fact, I thought I would take this opportunity to give viewers a sneak preview of the Reclaimed Voices documentary. You guys can't see it, unfortunately. It's only for people watching this later. But I'm going to show you a clip of me outside the gates of the Dutch Watchtower facilities in Emmen. What does that say? What does it say in English?
Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses in the Netherlands.
Hello, my name's Lloyd Evans. I'm here in the Netherlands making a documentary about the problem of child sex abuse among Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm wondering if I could get an interview.
Okay, and can you please repeat your name?
My name's Lloyd Evans.
Yes. And from which company are you, did you say?
JW Survey.
Okay. Okay, just a second.
Thank
Wait
you.
a minute. Good afternoon.
Hello.
We are contacting our public relations right now. Just a moment, please. So
Thank
that you
you.
know that you can wait.
Perfect, thank you. During what turned out to be an additional 5 minutes waiting at Watchtower's less than formidable gates, an unexpected opportunity presented itself when a package delivery driver arrived, oblivious to the fact that we were in the process of being denied entry.
We staan even te wachten eigenlijk op... we zijn een film aan het maken, dus vandaar.
Hoi, DHL.
It's a nice product placement for DHL.
Well, it's coming from Germany, so that's probably Watchtowers.
And we will wait respectfully.
Yeah, yeah.
Take this opportunity of
No, we're not running in.
Of course, we could have entered with the excuse that we assumed the gates had been opened for us, but we decided to be professional and continued waiting for an official green light.
Goedemiddag.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, we're just waiting for an answer from the Public Relations Office.
Ah, okay. You are JW Survey, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay, you were asking for an interview if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
The proper way to do that is to send us an email and to ask for such an interview.
Okay, what do you think my chances are of getting an interview if I pursue that course?
You never know. If you give your proposition and your idea about the interview, then we will answer that properly.
Speaking candidly, it would say a great deal about the organisation, given the subject matter of victims of abuse, if you could be eager to take this opportunity to sit down and talk about what your policies are and why they are beneficial or something that you can be proud of.
Yeah, that's not our media policy, so we prefer to have an email requesting an interview, then we can answer that.
Well, if it's not your media policy to do that, then there's no point requesting an interview, is there?
Well, it's your choice. You may request for an interview if you like. If you don't like to do that, that's all right with us.
But you are officially declining the opportunity to appear in this documentary?
Not necessarily, but we always reply on interview request by email. and never on the gates or never with a camera on our premises.
Could I have your email address?
That's VOOR.
Yeah.
LICHDING.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
.nl
Yeah.
at jw.org.
Wonderful. I will send an email, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Looks like they don't want to speak to me today.
Very surprising.
Should we have reactions?
I'm afraid you guys won't have been able to see that, but hopefully if you watch the rerun, you'll see it. It's remarkable for me to have been in that situation outside the gates and to have experienced firsthand how evasive Watchtower was, because they asked me to email and I did email and they never got back to me. Raymond, what do you sense is the response from the government, from the media, from non-Jehovah's Witnesses who you've had dealings with? How do they interpret the way Watchtower is stonewalling your efforts to get victims listened to?
Yeah, they are in a way they are astonished that this is happening, that an organization is this arrogant in not addressing the situation. And if you have already spoken to Atje Kuiken, I know that she is also part in the documentary. And Atje
Kuiken is a politician in the Dutch Parliament. Yes. Yeah.
And Atje Kuiken was at the protest that we had on the 6th of October, and she addressed the issue that that the gates stayed closed, that no one came out to receive a manifesto that we have written. And she was actually not amused at all. If she was telling that if an organization takes child safety seriously, then they would have been there. What you can see is that even the media is actually a little bit even confused why Watchtower does not respond at all or does not answer the questions that are raised. Now, I know in the RTL news article that they gave an answer, somehow a written answer. It's a really strange answer, since first they said that they would not cooperate with this investigation that will be done by the government. And now they are assuming that they are happy to give an explanation how they deal with child safety, what the policy on child safety is. And a few months ago, Watchtower said that it was a non-issue and it was shooting with a cannon on a mosquito. So actually, I think that they are trying to play that in a way they are cooperative right now, and that they even are playing the victim or something like that.
Raymond, I wanted to ask you, because I'm kind of, since we're talking on this, and we're talking about Watchtower's reaction.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if it's obviously that the efforts of your group and the media coverage in the Netherlands and all that stuff is playing a big part of it. But could it be that Watchtower is used to reacting to these to this coverage in the States, where they're getting coverage over civil cases? In the Netherlands, it seems like all of your efforts and the media coverage have spurred on people reporting these cases to the authorities, and it sparked criminal court cases.
Yes,
and this
correct.
might be like unfamiliar territory for Watchtower, responding to cases when it's a criminal case instead of a civil case. I think they have a lot more leeway to avoid and dodge and refuse to cooperate in civil cases, where in a criminal court case, that might not be the same thing. And so you get things like, a government raid on a criminal investigation that you wouldn't see that in a civil litigation. Could that be the case?
That's a very interesting point that you are raising, and I think that could be the case as well. And also the way it's also the message that Reclaimed Voices tries to spread. It's actually, we are trying to be as factual as possible. We're trying to keep our emotions out of it. It's not apostates. Yeah, of course, Watchtower is viewing us as apostates, but for the media or for the government, it's not about angry ex-members, but about certain people that are generally concerned with child safety and the way Watchtower is dealing with this aspect. And also, it's about us that we are not easy satisfied. So we keep putting pressure on this issue by mailing or contacting government, and we are sure that we try to get some information out in a monthly base right now, since if you had followed the whole process in the Netherlands, the child abuse problem within Watchtower has been in the news every month since November 2017. So I think that also contributes to the whole issue that this is taken very seriously right now. And Watchtower is, I think Watchtower is still hoping that it will go away in a way. Mm-hmm. And that, okay, they are now in stormy weather, but there will be a time that the storm is over, and they are putting. Actually, I spoke to an active JW today on the phone, and he was telling me that even within the JW congregations, they are not really concerned with this. I thought that they would say, okay, we are persecuted and they are worrying, but in a way it is not doing anything to those active Jehovah's Witnesses. It's like they are not touched by all what is covered in the media right now.
Raymond, you mentioned about how you are trying to be as objective and dispassionate about and focusing purely on the facts as possible. Mm-hmm. I just want to kind of underscore that, because obviously I had the pleasure of meeting you and the rest of Reclaimed Voices. And what you don't know, well, you know that you put me in touch with your lawyer, Nico Meijering, and I had the honor of interviewing him, a very prominent lawyer in the Netherlands and very knowledgeable person about law. And what you don't know is, and this will come out more in the documentary, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but it will be very obvious during the documentary that Nico is more annoyed and in a way more angry with Watchtower than you guys came across in your interview. Mm-hmm. When I was interviewing you guys, you were very under control and calm and being as objective as possible. But when I interviewed Nico, who isn't a Jehovah's Witness, he's just a lawyer who's seen what's going on, and he's seen how evasive Watchtower has been. Mm-hmm. He really, you could tell he was not impressed at all with Watchtower, and he had some very strong words to say about the organization. So I just find that very interesting.
Yeah, that brings us to the public reaction. And Raymond, I wanted to ask you about that. In the United States, obviously, we have a very major situation that happened some years ago with the Catholic Church. And now that there's been a resurgence of focus on the problems within the Catholic Church. So tell us what it's like in the Netherlands, because obviously your demographics are a little bit different there. Did you have the same kind of problem with the Catholic Church? And would you say that the public reaction has been, the Jehovah's Witnesses are maybe the second or third most reprehensible group in terms of the way that they handle or mishandle child abuse allegations? Is it similar to what the reaction we see in the U.S.?
most Dutch people are not religious at all anymore. So religion is not an important factor in Dutch society. But in 2010, there was an investigation into the Catholic Church, how they handled child abuse cases. This was huge in the Netherlands. The problem actually is, okay, the media is covering this every month, as I said, but Jehovah's Witnesses are still considered a minority group. There are 30,000 Jehovah's Witnesses in the Netherlands. So it's about one publisher in 500 residents in the Netherlands. And in a way, most people are not fully aware what Jehovah's Witnesses teach, how they view the world. So actually Jehovah's Witnesses are, of course, they are annoying since they call on your doors and they are witnessing with their cards at public places. But what those people do, they are not aware of. Religion is viewed abusive in all their how do we call that? In all their aspects. It doesn't matter if it is Jehovah's Witnesses or we have the Catholic Church. Recently, there's also some information about sexual abuse within Buddhist groups. There have always been stories about abuse within those fundamentalist Protestant groups in the Netherlands, but there was never, or I think it has never been a group that was lobbying the government to start an investigation into a specific group. So that's...
so I think what you're saying then, Raymond, is that the fact that the Netherlands seems to be a lot more secular than other countries is actually going to drive even more people away from not only religion, but especially Jehovah's Witnesses. And I think that's a point that needs to be brought home here, is that Jehovah's Witnesses thrive on, the fact that they are Bible-based Christians. They're fundamentalists. They don't like to use that term. But the fact is that when they have all of this negative publicity regarding how they handle child sexual abuse allegations, that's going to, I think even more so than the U.S., it's going to drive people away from any interest in their particular brand of...
Yeah, I think that's correct, what you're saying there.
I think from what I understood, what Raymond was explaining to, even though it's a secular country, the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses we're kind of shielded by the fact that there's, even within that country, they're considered a fringe group, and just like in the States, right? It's like, it's the funny stories of Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on your door and disturbing you. That's about as harmless as they appeared. But the scrutiny under the media coverage and all these cases is probably revealing that there's more to them than just, people knock on your door. It's the same effect that it has in other countries.
So Raymond, that's sadly all we have time for, because what viewers don't know up to this point is that this is actually a bonus show, and we have another guest to bring on to help us explore the issue of child sex abuse cover-up in another part of the world. But before you leave us, do you have any message to perhaps any Jehovah's Witnesses watching this from the Netherlands who are concerned about what's happening, or perhaps are doubtful of the motives of Reclaimed Voices and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, actually my message is, as always, as also the trailer from the documentary is showing, that it's actually not persecution. It's not Reclaimed Voices tearing down Watchtower. It's only, our interest is only child safety. And that's the reason why these raids happened, since Watchtower was not cooperating with the criminal investigation. So if Watchtower starts to cooperate, start addressing the issue, I'm quite sure that they will not be raided further or persecuted or prosecuted in these cases. So I will also invite Jehovah's Witnesses who are concerned. I'm quite sure that there are Jehovah's Witnesses that are concerned. You can contact us even anonymously if it is safe for you to do that. And please do that and share your story, since it is important to also share from inside that there are people concerned with this issue.
Wonderful. Raymond, I really do appreciate you joining us. Again, it was a huge honor to work with yourself, Frank, and Aswin, and also Nico during my visit to the Netherlands. I'm very excited about the documentary coming out soon, but I'm even more excited to see that the Dutch government and the Dutch authorities are doing something about child sex abuse. It's something that your country should be very proud of. And thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
Thank you, Raymond.
Thank you, Raymond. Bye.
Thank you.
So, viewers, as I mentioned, this is actually a bonus show. We do have another guest that we will be welcoming on shortly. But as you'll have noticed, we don't have a covert fade. We do, however, have a stand-in to take us through this week's news. And that stand-in comes in the form of the trusty Mark O'Donnell. So, Mark, I hope you don't mind if I get a little bit creative with the opening news credits and roll them now.
Let's do it. Bring it on. Okay, thanks, Lloyd. Appreciate that wonderful introduction. So we have a few items in the news that are very interesting. Some people have asked us to talk about the arsons that have happened in Washington State. So we're just going to mention that briefly and maybe talk about it a little bit. But there's been a series of allegedly targeted fires that have torn through the Jehovah's Witnesses over in the state of Washington in the U.S. That's on the West Coast. And this has actually happened since March, with the fifth fire set last Friday morning, I believe it was. And it's gotten to the point where now the not only are the state authorities and local authorities involved, but now the federal arson investigators have gotten involved because of the nature of this and the fact that they believe that these fires are linked. I believe the earlier fires were definitely linked, and now they're trying to connect those fires with this. Also mentioned in some of the news reports was the fact that in May there was a discharge of a weapon. There were some 35 rounds that were fired into one of the Kingdom Halls in Thurston County. And so this is really all we know at this point. There's an ongoing investigation. Now it's reached the federal level. And needless to say, you know, at JW Survey and Watchtower in Focus, we absolutely condemn any form of violence against Jehovah's Witnesses, whether it's property violence or physical, personal harm. But it's news and we have to cover it. And, you know, you can only imagine when this individual or group of individuals is eventually caught by the authorities. It'll be interesting to find out who did it and why they did it.
Yeah. As I said before we went on air, I've been asked to make videos on this. And as I said to you, I don't really know what I could say about it in a video other than this terrible thing is happening and it shouldn't be happening. And whoever's responsible for it needs to be apprehended as soon as possible before anyone gets killed. That's the thing with arson. Even if you are burning down an empty building, number one, you're destroying property. And number two, someone's going to have to put that fire out, and there's the risk of it spreading to other properties. So you are actually putting lives in danger. No, there's no justification in the world that could cover it. So we can only hope that this person is brought to justice quickly.
Yeah, and just as Mark was talking about that, I got a text from someone and I forwarded it to you guys, but it's a screenshot of a CNN Live, I guess, is covering this story about what's going on in Washington State. So, it looks like the press and the media are picking this up, and that just means it'll get more attention, and hopefully they catch this person soon and put an end to this. Because, yeah, you're right. It's putting lives at risk needlessly. There's no whatever point is trying to be made is lost by putting people's lives at risk. So
Indeed.
It's not the first time it's happened. I remember when I was very young, the Kingdom Hall in Maryland in Baltimore City that we attended, it was the Govins Kingdom Hall. It was set on fire by an arsonist, and we had to transfer to another Kingdom Hall for quite some time. And, I was young. I don't even remember who did it. I think it was some disgruntled person that, was eventually caught, I believe. But, it's been close to 50 years now. But anyway, I think we need to move on.
Yeah.
Unless somebody else has a comment about.
We've got our guest coming on soon, so we'll rattle through the other.
Yeah. So here's something interesting. Back in the summer in Sweden, a Swedish newspaper named The Metro reported that prosecutors. Well, actually, first I'm going to mention that back in the summer, the Metro newspaper reported on the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses had been playing certain videos that were anti-LGBT, and it has finally reached the point where last Thursday, an investigation has led to charges that have been brought against the assembly overseer in Stockholm, Sweden, for not following the requirements of properly registering the films that they played at those district conventions. And this is interesting because the films that are being played throughout Scandinavia, they actually have a commission, I believe it's called the Norwegian Media Council, and they are required to, when they play a film, especially a full-length film, and some of the JW films are, of close to 90 minutes in length, and some are shorter. But when they play these films, they are required to register them with the Norwegian Media Council so that they're approved, because they know that in an audience of, in this case, it was over 8,000, that there are going to be many young children there, and they want to make sure that the films that are being shown to children are age appropriate. And I believe it was brought out in the article that some of the content was really offensive to the Media Council, including, Armageddon, destruction, and also the anti-LGBT themes, which were really a little bit too mature for audiences where I think we both know that children as young as baby in arms are carried into Watchtower's conventions throughout the world.
Interesting. Yeah, it's certainly something that authorities need to be taking a look at. If there are laws surrounding public showings of films, I can't think of a more opportune time to be enforcing those laws than when we're dealing with very disturbing religious propaganda.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that was mentioned at the very end of the article, there was a box, and this was a Swedish article, which you can easily translate into using the Google Translate, but it mentioned that in Sweden there were approximately 22,000 active Jehovah's Witnesses and over 300 congregations. But then they went on to make the point that they are the only religious community that has been denied government grants. And it said in 2017, the government said no. It said no with the motivation that society urges its members not to receive blood transfusion for minors. So I'm reading a Google translated statement there, but the gist of that is that there have been government grants that apparently normally the witnesses or any religious group would have been able to apply for, and they're denied that on the basis of the fact that they have this blood policy, which is considered which is considered not a good thing over in Scandinavian countries. It's oppressive.
Do we know what these grants might be for? I'm just out of curiosity.
The article didn't specify, but we can certainly do further research and follow up on that in a future article. And in fact, I may get in touch with a journalist over in Sweden, and perhaps in the next episode we can talk about that.
Good stuff. And do you have any other story before we move on to our guest?
Yeah, so we have one small snippet. Many of our viewers will know Amber Scora, who is a writer and an ex-Jehovah's Witness advocate who lives in New York. She gained a lot of attention some years ago when she wrote an article in believermag.com, and the article was called "Leaving the Witness." And it was extremely well written. And what it was about was Amber was a Jehovah's Witness from the Pacific Northwest, I believe, and she went over to China to basically be a need grader, which is a term that witnesses use for preaching in an area where, you know, there's either limited number of people, limited number of congregations, or even in an area where the work is banned. In China, the work of Jehovah's Witnesses is banned. So she went through this whole process of learning Chinese, going to, I think, Taiwan as a staging area, then went into China. And she told her story about what it was like waking up in a country as far away as China. It's just a fascinating story. I'd love to get into it, but we don't have the time. But Amber has written a book which expands upon that story and tells her entire life story regarding her becoming a witness, going over to China, waking up, and leaving the organization. And so the announcement was just made last week on Amazon. I believe the book's available in June of 2019, so you can go on Amazon. Just go to Amazon.com and search for Amber Scora, Scorah, and Leaving the Witness.
And I have actually reached out to Amber because Amber is a friend of both me and Deanna. We met up with her during a recent trip to America, and she has told me that she will be coming on the channel for an interview. So Terrific. Stay tuned, and you'll hopefully hear a little bit more about what I can tell you is a fascinating story. So we're coming up on the time that where we have our second guest on. I should probably let viewers know what's happening here. You'll be familiar with our recent coverage of the Montana lawsuit in Montana that Mark actually flew out to take detailed notes and report back on what's been happening. Mark, in addition to reporting on the case, was also basically acting as a consultant to the plaintiff's defense, to the plaintiff's legal team. And Mark, am I right in saying that you've managed to bag us an interview with a key member of that team?
Yeah, so I was very happy to have had a chance out in Montana to meet Neil Smith.
And here he is. Hello, Neil.
And that's a great segue. Hi, Neil.
Your ears must have been burning there, Neil.
They were. Good to see you guys.
Good to see you.
We just had a great chat with Raymond from Reclaimed Voices, who filled us in on the raids that are going on in the Netherlands. And I think one thing that was really interesting was the fact that he mentioned how critical the S-77 disfellowshipping form was in one of the cases that really interested the police, who then raided these elders' homes, the branch office, and 2 kingdom halls. So that's a great segue into Montana, because as I recall, and I have a few of these forms here on my desk, there were only a limited number of pieces of evidence that sealed the deal for the Montana case. And one of them was this S-77 form, which you managed to get a hold of. So, and I don't want to jump too far into this, but thank you for joining us. And I know a lot of people are very interested in this Montana case because of the implications that it has for other child abuse cases, and the fact that it was such a large penalty that the jury, not anyone else, not the judge, but it was a jury who awarded not only charges or a penalty for negligence, but they checked the box that said that Watchtower was malicious in its intent to prevent the local elders from reporting the abuse that they knew about to the authorities. So I guess that's a good enough way to get started, and maybe we can have a chance to ask you a few questions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Thanks for having me, Mark. You bring up a good point. we offered 4 exhibits as evidence in the Montana trial. And one of them was the S-77 disfellowship form, which I got to tell you, we had to fight very, very hard to get our hands on that document. And I discovered the links that the Jehovah's Witnesses will go to keep those documents a secret. But it was critical to our case. We got our hands on it, and I think it was the piece of evidence that showed that what Lexi Nunez was saying was true. It substantiated what she had said.
Yeah, in that case, it was, there's line number 1, which says that Max Reyes, who is the perpetrator, for those that don't know, was disfellowshipped for porneia. And of course, that was explained to the jury, what that was. But it says he admitted to fondling the genitals of an 8-year-old boy at least 3 times. So when we're talking about the boy, we're talking about someone who was not a plaintiff in this case, but he was actually the brother of one of the plaintiffs and the uncle of the other plaintiff. But item number 2 gives an extremely detailed account, and I don't know that our viewers are actually going to be able to see that there, but it gives a very detailed account of the abuse. And I was surprised, and perhaps you were surprised, to see that much detail was given on the S-77 form, which really amounted to a smoking gun in this case.
I was surprised when I initially got involved in this case. I didn't expect the abuse to be that well documented. However, when I found the efforts the church was going to prevent us from getting this document, then I realized the level of detail it had. And just so you know the history, we fought to get this document. Once we received this document, it had portions of the information on it blacked out. And then there was a ruling by the court that required them to turn over the entire document to us with no portions blacked out. And only then could we see the details in that document and have those details to show to the jury.
Neil, before you came on, we had a conversation because obviously viewers will be mindful of the fact that Watchtower is appealing the case. In some respects, it's a moving story and you need to keep your cards fairly close to your chest. So it's totally understood if there's some things that you can't divulge. But viewers who've seen my recent interview with Mark will know that Mark recently had an encounter with Phil Brumley, who is Watchtower's head legal counsel, in which Phil Brumley rather naively divulged quite a lot of strategy and reaction to the Montana lawsuit. I'm presuming you're aware of all that. How significant was this conversation, or was it just an insight into the sort of naivety behind Watchtower's legal department?
Yes, I've heard a little bit of that information. And while it's interesting, I think to me it came as no surprise just in dealing with them. The issue that they are really hung up on and that they feel that they will win on appeal is the issue we've been hearing about from them for some period of time now.
And just to kind of make that absolutely abundantly clear, are we talking about the fact that they feel that they have clergy privilege?
Yes, so there's 2 issues that come up when we talk about clergy privileges, and sometimes they get mixed together. But the thing is, what Watchtower is trying to do is trying to abuse the concept of clergy penitent privilege. What the clergy penitent privilege is it's a privilege that belongs to the church member to say, hey, if I spoke with a clergy member in confidence, I can keep that protected. There's a variation of that privilege that comes up in Montana when a state has, like Montana has a mandatory reporter law that requires clergy to report abuse. In Montana, there is an exception that pops up that says, if this is a confidential communication that you kept confidential, there's an exception for reporting. And what has amazed me about this case is the lengths to which Watchtower has gone to try to shoehorn the facts of this case into that exception when it does not fit. And as an example of that, so the listeners can know what we're talking about, at trial, a representative from Watchtower actually testified that if a child comes to Watchtower, to the church, and says, "Please help me. I'm not coming to you in confidence. I don't want you to keep this confidential," the church's response will be, "Well, we're going to keep this confidential so that we can try to fit within these exceptions." And, you know, that was really shocking testimony to me, and Mark was there at the trial, I think, to listeners to hear that.
Yeah, that was the testimony of Watchtower Rep Doug Chappell, as I recall. And he was notoriously nervous on the stand. I think the first time he was sworn in, and I believe he was your first witness. He was
that is correct.
First witness called, and he couldn't get his words out. He had to have a glass of water, and it was right after lunch, and he actually told the judge, he said, "I'm sorry, lunch made my throat dry," and, you know, he was extremely nervous. He actually admitted to being nervous.
He didn't have Jehovah's help in giving his testimony.
I have a question for Neil, if I may.
Sure.
Because you know, after Mark's interview with Lloyd, you go on Twitter and there's debates and comments from apologists and all that stuff. And I want to ask you a question about the mandatory reporting laws and those exceptions. There is no gray area, right? The law is clearly defined as to who is a mandatory reporting and what the circumstances are that require reporting versus those exceptions. Am I right to say that?
It was extremely clear in this case. While I'm sure we could sit around and come up with some scenario where it is gray, it wasn't in this case. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. The exception that they're trying to fit this case into requires that communications to them, that they learn something and in confidence. That's one of the elements. Well, in this particular case, when the elders received this information about a child abuser, they went and they contacted Max Reyes, the child abuser. They took the information and they not only did they not keep it confidential, that went on to prove that it wasn't a confidential communication. In addition to that, one of my plaintiffs, Holly, testified that when I wrote this letter to you and I shared this information, I wasn't asking you to keep this confidential. I was seeking help. And another victim also said I was trying to keep other kids from being victims of an abuser. So in answer to your question, with these particular facts, there was not a gray area. It was an easy decision. And, that's the thing to me that has been shocking about this particular church is, and Mark knows this from sitting through the trial, this is what we explained to the jury. This was not a situation where an elder accidentally made a mistake and accidentally failed to report someone when he should have. What happened in Montana was done according to policy. It was done by the books. And every elder in the facts that we had did exactly what they were taught to do and what they were expected to do. And what they were taught to do is to call headquarters in New York, and those guys will tell you what to do. And if they tell you you don't have to report it, you better keep your mouth shut, or you will answer to Jehovah and you'll pay a price. And the elders in this particular case did exactly as they were told.
Just to follow up on that one, because another thing that comes up often about this case is that so it was determined before it went into jury deliberation that Watchtower had broken Montana law, right? Now, the argument is always that that was a call made by the judge and that he pretty much took it upon himself and gave his interpretation of what is the law. Is that the case here, or does the judge not have that room to make those kind of determinations because the law is clear? I want to just get some clarity so this information gets out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in this case, you're exactly right. Before the case went to the jury, the judge determined that certain violations had occurred. So questions go to the jury when there are facts that could be decided one way or another. And in this particular case, the church, all of the facts that they presented showed that they knew there was a child molester, that they failed to report him, but they were relying on this exception. Now, whether an exception applies or not was a question of law for the judge. So once the judge determined that the exception did not apply, all of the undisputed facts proved a violation of law. So in essence, what the court was saying is there are no facts here where a jury could decide the case otherwise. Another additional thing that happened is that my side and Watchtower submitted the question on whether there was a legal violation to the judge to decide. And in doing so, both the plaintiffs that I represented, the victims, and the Watchtower Church were saying, Judge, this is a question of law for you to decide. So both sides told the court, this isn't a question for the jury, this is a question for the court, and the court decided it in the favor of the victims.
Thank you for clarifying that, because that's a question that just, like, I always struggle to answer that one, because I'm not a legal professional, but I'm glad it's out there now and people can hear that.
And just to further clarify it, because we spoke earlier about the S-77 being something of a smoking gun. What smoking gun was there? Was there a document, or was there some kind of evidence showing that Watchtower told the elders not to go to the police?
So there were 4 paper exhibits that we offered into evidence, and there was some so there was the S-77, and there was some communication back and forth in writing between the local elders and the Watchtower headquarters. In that communication, Watchtower and the elders acknowledged that no one in the congregation knows about this guy, and the local community and the authorities don't know. So the written exhibits kind of acknowledged that the police hadn't been reported, but actually the witnesses are the local elders and the representatives of Watchtower are the ones that said, we had the elders contact the legal department, and the legal department said you are not required to report this.
Wow.
Yeah.
Even though they were required to report this.
Even though they were required. And I found that Watchtower headquarters and their lawyers like to do a little dance, and they try to say, well, we just told you didn't have to report it. And they try to leave this impression that it was up to the elders, that they could go report it if they wanted to. And that's where, to me, it was so important that we finally got to the bottom of saying, well, it's not up to the elders, because you instruct them that if they ignore what you tell them to do, they're going to pay the price with God in the afterlife. And, that's a powerful threat to hang over someone's head. And the elders in our case said, they were aware of that, and that's why they did what the legal department told them to do.
Yeah, I think that was part of your line of questioning with Doug Chappell, was you really drilled down deep into the fact that if an elder were to break policy, then that would, and it was like pulling teeth to get that out of him, but that would result in not only disfavor with God, but with the organization itself. And effectively what you proved was that if an elder strayed from that policy, he would no longer be an elder any longer. Or worse.
I have another question if we're cool on time. I just specifically in the Montana case, what would Watchtower, what could they have done to have been in compliance and avoid this kind of litigation? What would have been the perfect thing for them to do to avoid this whole mess?
All they had to do was notify Department of Human Services or Child Protective Services that they were aware of a child that was being abused. And then that would have allowed law enforcement, Child Protective Services, people that are trained to respond to this to come in, and find out that there are children that are being exposed to a known child molester, and it would have protected our plaintiff in the case from continued abuse. The abuse would have stopped.
So it's virtually, it's a multi-million-dollar phone call is what it costs. I mean, it really is.
Yeah.
That is exactly right.
I mean, it's more important that they could have maybe helped future victims, but for themselves, we're looking at them, you know, them being selfish. They could have protected themselves from this stuff if they would have just picked up the phone. And that to me is amazing.
You're exactly right. And I'm going to turn the tables right now, and I'm going to flip the question back to you guys that know more than I know. And that's the question that I have in my mind, which is, and I present this to each of you, why doesn't Watchtower just make that phone call? What's in it for them? Why are they obsessed with saying no one's going to tell us what to do, and we're not going to let anyone know what's happening within our church? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I've agonized over this question quite a lot over the years that I've been doing my activism and writing on this subject, and there are two potential reasons. The more conspiratorial XJWs will tell you, or they will put forward the theory that perhaps the issue with child sex abuse reaches into the Watchtower hierarchy, so that they are afraid that if they back down on child sex abuse, it will uncover some senior members of Watchtower who have themselves been involved in child sex abuse. That's kind of a more out there conspiratorial theory. My own theory, the best I can come up with, is that they view this similar to the issue with blood transfusions. This is our interpretation of how Bible law should be applied. We are not going to have Satan's system of things tell us how Bible law is to be applied. If we have already come up with a two-witness rule, and if we have already decided that this two-witness rule applies even to cases of child sex abuse, it should be for us to change our minds and not for us to succumb to external pressure to produce new light on this issue. So any pressure, whether it's through the media or whether it's through lawsuits, we will interpret that as attacks by Satan to water down our spiritual paradise, our moral purity. And it's a test. We need to pass this test by sticking to our guns and making sure we don't cave in. That's the best I've got in terms. The only way I can really explain why they would suffer all of these multi-million-dollar settlements and lawsuits, because the common sense thing is to just notify the police.
I would agree with that. And, you know, first of all, I want to mention in the middle of the Fessler trial, the question you just asked me, we were taking a 15-minute break, and one of the attorneys from Fessler turned to me and said, "Mark, why are they doing this?" He asked the same question you asked, because it was very clear that that trial was being lost. I mean, it was going very poorly for Watchtower. There wasn't any evidence that was being presented that was favoring Watchtower. And he looked at me and he said, you know, why are they doing this? You know, they're writing our check. Basically, this is how we're earning a living. Why are they doing it? So, you know, I can explain the best way I can, very similar to what Lloyd said. Jehovah's Witnesses are a very insular organization, a very insular society. They wouldn't exist if they didn't believe that they are the one true faith, the one true religion. So there's a scripture in the book of Acts that says we must obey God as ruler rather than men. And that's sort of a mantra for Jehovah's Witnesses. So they believe that they obey God's law implicitly rather than men or Caesar's law. But at the same time, they apply Romans chapter 13, which says that they would obey secular law, of course, except where it conflicts with God's law. They call the secular authority Caesar. And what I would say to you is that whenever there is a principle in the Bible that starts in the Hebrew scriptures and is reiterated in the Christian Greek or the New Testament, then Jehovah's Witnesses jump all over that and they make that part of their doctrine.
To the point of requiring people to die.
Yeah, so we have two examples of that. Number one, we have child abuse. We have the two-witness rule. That appears in the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament. They need two witnesses in order to establish a matter. Then it comes forward into the Christian Greek scriptures, the New Testament, and that several places in the New Testament, they also mention two witnesses are required to establish a matter. Then that becomes something that ties the whole Bible together, and Jehovah's Witnesses believe that that two-witness rule absolutely must apply, because not only was it a principle in the Old Testament, but it's a principle in the New Testament. And as Lloyd was alluding to, you have the same thing with blood. You have scriptures in Leviticus that say blood is sacred, it must be poured out on the ground. And then you have Acts chapter 5, I think, which says, that you must abstain from things sacrificed to idols and from blood and from fornication, and good health to you. So whenever there is this principle and it's reinforced in the New Testament, then that becomes part of their doctrine, and that is probably the best answer I can give you as to why they press so hard. But then they combine that with their freedom of, the religion was born here in the United States, right? So under the freedoms that they have, they believe that they can continue to exercise their religious rights under those constitutional laws that protect religious faith and belief. And you've run into that in court, obviously.
And just to add to that, Neil, to our frustration, probably all three of us have brought this up with people that we knew were elders, or we've had these conversations with active Jehovah's Witnesses. And like Lloyd and Mark say, they truly believe this. But what frustrates me the most is that there is precedent of Watchtower changing some kind of practice or doctrine because they've had to comply with a change in the legal system. So Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they went from selling literature by contribution to voluntary donations. That was a direct result as a change in litigation, some legal action that happened in the United States. And what drives me nuts is that they can comply with those laws and still maintain whatever doctrine or religious practice they want to maintain, two-witness rule, whatever they want to keep for internal judicial processes. They can keep that and still comply with the law, but they make it a bigger issue, and it becomes all or nothing, right? It's if they give in on this one issue, then I think they see it as this is Satan's system coming after the religion, and they're going to have to fight from giving in on everything else that they believe and they hold onto. So it really is a question of faith, and unfortunately it blinds them from policies that really do affect real people in very, very harmful negative ways. And
in fact, Angus Stewart provided a scriptural precedent during the Australian Royal Commission to demonstrate. He gave the example of, in the Mosaic law, of how if a woman is raped in the field and there are no witnesses, the man who raped her is still to be executed, I think. So there's a clear Bible precedent that you can apply to child sex abuse in cases where there are no witnesses. But almost as soon as that very coherent, very logical reasoning was shown to a governing body member, Jeffrey Jackson, I was immediately thinking, there's no way they'll take that, because just by virtue of the fact that this scriptural argumentation has been unveiled by a quote-unquote worldly person, how on earth are they supposed to then go to 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses and say, hey, we've just had new light that we are supposed to consider this verse? Everyone's just going to say, well, Angus Stewart, an Australian lawyer, showed you that. So quite clearly, you're not God's one and only true spokesperson or mouthpiece. It's quite tragic, really, that basically it all boils down to pride.
Which makes, Neil, what the work that you're doing is so valuable, because that's the only way people can have an impact into that, is if there's a financial cost to these big organizations. And we were talking to Raymond from Reclaimed Voices. We're starting to see now that in Europe there's criminal cases now being formed, and there's raids and all that stuff. I think that will spark some change, hopefully. But in the States, at least, the only method to get attention to this has been civil litigation cases like the one you were a part of. So, I mean, you know, I want to thank you for that. You know, I might not get a chance to do it later. So that means a lot to us. It really does, you know, because we can have these conversations and the media can cover this stuff. It's a big, huge deal.
Another thing that's interesting, Neil, is that, and I may have mentioned this to you possibly in past conversations, but we had all become aware of a case in Delaware in which a 14-year-old baptized Jehovah's Witness boy had been having sex with a woman who was twice his age. And this was a very clear-cut case where the elders should have gone to the authorities under Delaware law. And Delaware has, because of the pedophilia of a excuse me, of a pediatrician named Earl Bradley who made national news, Delaware has enforced their laws to the point where if you violate the law on mandatory child abuse reporting, so if you're, for example, a teacher, a clergy member, or a doctor, you must report or there's a penalty. They'll penalize you $10,000 per incident for the first incident and $50,000 for each additional failure to report. Well, even knowing this, just a few years ago, the elders in a congregation in Delaware failed to report, and it infuriated, the state's attorney found out about it, and it infuriated them so much that the state's attorney, the deputy state's attorney, actually filed charges against, or took Watchtower to court, and Watchtower ended up settling in order to cover up the documents. And I had to file a Freedom of Information Act report to get the settlement documents in which Watchtower acknowledged that obviously they had broken the law. So when Watchtower says, and you heard this in court from Watchtower's own attorneys, we obey the law. They tried to tell the jury many times in the Montana case that we absolutely obey Caesar's law. But they still, in Delaware, even just within the past 2 years, they still did not obey the law and ended up being fined almost $20,000, and they had to go to mandatory child abuse reporting training classes, and all the Delaware's and elders in Delaware were notified. So they're not getting the point, and that brings me to my next question, which is, we've talked about this offline, and maybe you have some thoughts about the Delaware case, but the $35 million pending jury award was, I think, based on my research, one of the largest single awards given by a jury to any single victim. In this case, it was awarded to Lexi Nunez, but to any single victim of child abuse because of failure to report. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because we talked a little bit about that offline.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've heard that comment from some other commentators that it's the largest they're aware of. I know that there have been larger verdicts. I know my firm was involved in a $37 million verdict, but you make a good point. Those were multi-plaintiff verdicts. So I don't know the answer to it, but now you've got me interested and I want to find out. Definitely our case involved an element of compensatory damages for $4 million and punitive damages for the remainder of the verdict. So there are those two components. So I'm going to do a little research on that.
Could for the benefit of our listeners and the viewers, could you explain just how significant it was when that jury checked that box? Maybe you could tell them what that box was. They had to check a box for malice, and that box, just one check mark by that jury, resulted in an entirely different jury deliberation, and that's when you revealed Watchtower's net worth. And by the way, you were the first person to publicly ever reveal Watchtower's net worth, as well as the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. That was a significant moment in history.
Yeah, I lost the pool on that one, by the way. So.
Yeah, that was really significant in the case. And just so the listeners understand what we're talking about, there was a question for the jury that asked whether the defendants were guilty of malice. And there was an instruction for what malice is. So not only did the jury have to find that the defendants acted with malice, there was a higher evidentiary standard for that question. So normally when we try a case like this, you have to prove a case beyond a preponderance of the evidence. But on that particular question, we as plaintiffs had to prove that by clear and convincing evidence. And what we had to show was that the defendants were aware of the risk to Lexi, but that they just proceeded with indifference to the harm that could occur to her. So it was a really, really high evidentiary standard. And when the jury came back in, the first thing they were asked was this what we call phase one of the trial was whether the defendant was negligent, and if so, what was the amount of damages. In that phase one, they were asked this malice question. Because the jury answered yes, that's when we went to the second phase, and that was, what is the proper amount of punitive damages? And as we discussed, I don't know if this was the largest single plaintiff verdict, but based upon that punitive damages amount, the jury definitely wanted to send a message. That's the purpose of punitive damages. And they came back with a $31 million punitive damage verdict, and they came back with that amount in a pretty short amount of time.
It was less than an hour.
Less than an hour.
Neil, I have a question. I'm sure you will be very familiar with the Candace Conti lawsuit, which prior to this was really one of the biggest kind of stories in terms of verdicts against Watchtower. I can remember covering the Candace Conti story from when it first broke in 2012 through a number of years of it being appealed by Watchtower. And I think I speak for a lot of ex-witnesses in saying that there was a certain amount of despondency in the way that Watchtower had managed to slow down proceedings, to stop there being some closure to that whole case, to the point where eventually it ended up being settled. What can you give us any idea about what you envision to be the timescale moving forward, and how confident you are about preserving the jury's judgment in your case?
Yeah, so time-wise, here's what to expect. There is a final order that we're waiting on from our trial court that I expect we will see maybe by the end of the year, definitely in January. When that order comes out, it will start the appeals process, and because Montana is a relatively small state, there is only one layer to the appeals process, and that is an appeal to the Montana Supreme Court, which happens as a matter of right. And I'm told that that process takes about 1.5 to 2 years. So, timeline-wise, we can expect that next year we're going to have briefing both from my team and from Watchtower. That'll be public documents that we can share with you guys and share with the public. And then eventually that will culminate with probably an oral argument at the Montana Supreme Court and a final decision. And I fully expect that this is a case that will be decided based upon a final opinion by the Montana Supreme Court.
Interesting.
Pack your bags, Mark.
Yeah.
Well, I have the feeling that's going to be probably decided very quickly and without a lot of fanfare, but it's going to interest a lot of people because $35 million is a lot of money. And we talked about this offline. So one of the things that people are noticing, and you could comment briefly on this, is that there is a Montana statute that apparently limits the award to a percentage. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, because as soon as the $35 million judgment was mentioned in the press, then people started reading into this limitation. And so can you tell us about that limitation and whether or not that's constitutionally going to be an issue for your team and for Watchtower?
Yes. So in Montana, there is a statutory limit on the amount of punitive damages that a jury can award. And the limit, I don't have the briefing in front of me, but the limit is described as either being a percentage of the defendant's net worth or some maximum amount. And the amount that the jury awarded is over those limits that are set by statute. We, as plaintiffs, have argued, based upon a U.S. Supreme Court opinion, that that limit is unconstitutional and should be struck down. And I believe some courts, some lower courts in Montana have done that in the past, and we cited to them. So that's the decision that the trial court will need to decide. And regardless of how the trial court decides it, it will be an issue that goes up on appeal. And that's been a real hot appellate issue really for the last 15 years in both the U.S. Supreme Court and state Supreme Courts, is deciding when can states limit punitive damages and what are the conditions and terms where they can properly limit punitive damages. If you look at the facts of our case, Lexi Nunez, the jury awarded her $4 million in actual or compensatory damages. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, as her lawyers, we argued for $3 million, and the jury came back with an amount even larger than what we had suggested. When you look at the amount of punitive damages relative to the amount of actual damages, it's less than, a 10-time multiplier. And that is, that's a pretty reasonable multiplier that you're looking at. And our position is that's what the court should look at when analyzing punitive damages, as opposed to just saying there's some hard number that's fixed out there that doesn't consider the facts of this case, who the defendant is, or anything like that.
So, Neil, I have another question for you. This particular case got a lot of media attention in the press. And I think what tends to happen is when a big case like this comes out, it kind of gives people who might have not reported cases or been on the fence about litigating or anything like that, it kind of gives them the courage to move forward, right? So can you tell us if you've seen, if people have reached out to you for litigation, and if there's something that might be in the pipeline and is just about ready to go to court or anything like that that you can share if you can with us?
Yeah, so I have received a number of phone calls, and my office has been very, very busy talking to other victims and screening new cases. And for folks that are listening out there, the advice that I give to anyone who may have legal rights, they may know someone, is to act now. Because one of the saddest things for me is to have to tell victims that, you're right, you were a victim. Your rights were violated. There is a law that protects you, but unfortunately, your state that you're in has applied a deadline for when you can bring a case, and that deadline has expired. And that happens so often, and it's very difficult news to share with people. And that's why I always say, if you think you may have rights, you may know someone who's a victim, act now. Contact a lawyer you trust, contact my office, contact somebody nearby, and talk to them about it. And the other thing I tell them is, even if you can't pursue your legal rights, if you want to make a difference, let's go the next step and say, okay, maybe you can't bring a case, but are there other victims of this same perpetrator that you know about? Reach out to them, make sure they do something. Are there other victims in your congregation, or like you guys are doing, where you're taking the broader picture and saying, are there other victims within this organization? What can we do to spread the word and share with them? And that's the message that I'm constantly telling folks that contact me, whether they do have a claim they can bring or not.
I think it was horrific what happened to the victims in your case, two of them being your plaintiffs, and one, it was interesting watching the Peter, who testified for the defense, to see that he was one of the victims. Holly was the older of the three victims, but if they had reported what she reported back in 1998, which, by the way, Watchtower said that never happened. And I found that very interesting, that they blamed the victim, denied those claims, that she reported it to the elders. And I'm sure you have some comments and thoughts on that. But as a result of those reports not being made to the police, then we have the youngest of the victims, Lexi, who ultimately received the judgment from the jury, was abused on multiple occasions by Max Reyes, who, by the way, has fled to Mexico. But it just reinforces the fact that what you're doing is so important, because if we don't hold these organizations accountable, then another family member and another family member and then a friend or a cousin or somebody that comes in contact with the perpetrator gets abused. And we all know of cases where there have been 10, 12, 14 or more victims because they don't stop at one victim. It's a crime of opportunity. And it broke my heart to sit there in that courtroom and see these were real tears that were shed by Holly and Lexi. And, these are real people that were abused, and they didn't have to be. The police could have been called after that first report, and that they could have protected or done everything possible to protect Lexi and also Peter and others, because we don't know that this person it could be down in Mexico abusing other people.
Yeah, from all indication, he seems to be still involved in the organization down there.
Astonishing.
Another question I wanted to ask you, there was a lot of emotional moments in this trial, but at the very end, after the negligence award was given, the $4 million award was given, then the jury had to go back in and renegotiate because they found that Watchtower was guilty of malice. And Joel Taylor, for the defense, who is a Jehovah's Witness elder, got up there and he made a tearful plea. And in fact, I think one of the things he said was, here's all the good things we do. We do hurricane relief work, even for non-Jehovah's Witnesses, which is not true, by the way. But he made this tearful plea and said, please allow us to continue doing the work. And to the victims that are sitting here, we're sorry. We're sorry for what happened to you. And the moment he stopped that round of that appeal to the jury, you stood up without missing a beat. And I don't know if you remember what you said, but you said something to the effect of, now that was the first time, and it wasn't until you sent that message and that $4 million verdict, it wasn't until you sent that message that you heard an apology from Watchtower.
Yeah, Mark, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I remember the feeling in that courtroom, and I suspect you shared it, and I suspect the jury shared it. And when those words came out of his mouth, all I could remember thinking is, this is too little, too late. Here's a guy that has spent 2 days trying to drag up every nasty thing from my plaintiff's past and looks for every nasty thing he can say about them, whether it's related to this case or not. And then now, all of a sudden, when someone says you're going to have to get out your checkbook, he suddenly starts to say, we're sorry. And I haven't spoken with the jury. I wanted them to be able to decide this case and not be bothered. So I haven't reached out to them. But as I looked at what was going on in the courtroom and in the jury box, I don't think what Watchtower was saying at that time was very well received.
And actually, my question is related to that, and it may require some diplomacy on your part, because obviously I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to following Watchtower and Watchtower history, and what you will routinely see is Watchtower talk up its legal prowess. Some of it is deserved when you look at the civil rights victories that have had broader implications for American citizens and religious liberties and that kind of thing. But they will routinely point to the prowess of their legal department in securing the rights of Jehovah's Witnesses. What are your reflections, having come face to face with Watchtower's legal machine? What are your impressions of them as lawyers?
I had a similar experience, and that was when I was first involved in this case, their approach was, we're going to overpower you. And you know, I remember them pulling me aside and saying, well, we don't pay on these types of cases. This is an incest case. As if they thought maybe I would just say, well, I'll take my football and go home. You win. And I remember that conversation, and I said, well, okay, you know, it's not like I haven't ever seen the inside of a courtroom before. It's fine by me if you're not going to pay. If you don't understand the case I'm bringing and you think this is an incest case, which is what they kept repeating, that's your fault. That's not mine. So I had a similar experience. It was a, you know, they have a big ego about how they control litigation and they decide what happens. So I think it just took seeing the inside of a courtroom to have, you know, neutral people decide the issues.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah, but they, you know, there is in civil litigation, there's a system for how we're supposed to exchange information and documents to prepare a case for trial. And their approach is, we're not going to give you anything, and the rules don't apply to us. And it took a number of rulings by the judge. Thankfully, we had such a great judge that ruled really, really efficiently. Him ruling, no, this is something you have to turn over. And it allowed us to proceed forward and get to trial without too much delay, and to try the case in a pretty rapid fashion.
Is the tactic behind that strategy to cause exactly what you said, to cause the plaintiff to say, you know what, I will take my football and go home? Is that the strategy? Is that really strategic?
I think anytime someone's on the defense side, they always benefit from delaying the case and making it more difficult for you to get what you need to go try the case. You know, I tried this case with 4 exhibits. If somebody would have just turned those over to me at the beginning and answered my questions, we could have tried it even sooner.
Wonderful. Now, Neil, I'm mindful of the fact that you are an extremely busy man, and we've had some wonderful insights from you already. So I'm going to kind of steer the show towards its conclusion. What we tend to do is we go around the panel and sum up. And obviously you weren't here for the conversation with Raymond, but I know you're aware of what's happened recently with the raids of the offices in Emmen in the Netherlands, and the proactive stance that the Dutch authorities are taking with child sex abuse in that country. So I'm going to go through the whole panel, yourself included, and just ask to sum up on the situation before we conclude. Perhaps we'll start with Mark. What are your thoughts on what we've heard today?
Yeah, I think, well, we talked about it before with Raymond from Reclaimed Voices. These things are not coming to the forefront unless somebody actually does something about them, and it starts on a grassroots level. So what Raymond and his team have done in the Netherlands has put together a team where they've reached out to the public and said, you know, we want to help you. We know there are victims out there. We know that much of it's been covered up by Watchtower, and people that have grown up in the Watchtower organization are used to being in that insular group. So they're not used to the legal process. They don't know how to vote. We didn't grow up being part of elections and school plays and all the things that normal kids get to do. So they have to learn the political and legal system all over again. So they need help. So what Raymond has done has been just fantastic in starting this grassroots movement that got so many victims brought to their organization, which they then turned over to the police, which was the right thing to do. Then also the media got involved. And once the media got involved, then that further interested the authorities, and they said, we've got to do something about it. So on that topic, I just want to thank Raymond and Frank and Oswin from the Netherlands for what they've done, and you, Lloyd, for going over there and interviewing them, because we know a documentary is coming up soon by Christmas, I think. And
trying, yeah.
we're looking forward to that because that was a lot of work. And but I think if we see that in other countries, even in the U.S., where people get together and try to help other victims, write articles, write blogs, get involved. You can get involved with JW Survey. You know, that's the best thing to do, and do it in every country, because we know that there are thousands and thousands of unreported cases. I know in one country we intercepted a document in which the branch office for this South American country reported that to Watchtower headquarters that there were something like 300 or more cases in the last service year, which is their yearly cycle. And that's just one country. So we know that this is a problem. We've seen what happened with the Australian Royal Commission and how many thousands of cases were brought forward. So that's my advice to people, to get involved. And secondly, thank you, Neil, for everything that you guys did. I was so impressed that you were able to handle this case, and we talked about this offline, in just 3 days. That was very interesting to me, and maybe you can say it in your wrap up here, but you know, the Conti case was 10 or 11 days at least before a jury. The Fessler case was 4 days before a jury. This case, from opening arguments and jury selection to the final verdict, was 3 days. And I wasn't expecting
more than his football.
You brought a lot more than your football, and you sent me home early because I had booked the
He brought cleats, shoulder pads, helmet.
You did. You did. And I think one of the interesting things you said to me, Neil, was that you, and maybe you can comment on this, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but you said that keeping it simple with just 4 lines of evidence was being respectful of the jury's time, because you didn't want to cloud their heads with too much evidence. You wanted to get right to the point. And that never occurred to me. It seemed to ring very true with that jury. And I know it's a gamble, because you could have brought in a lot more, you know, you could have brought in a lot more witnesses to testify and pieces of evidence, but you chose not to. So maybe you can comment on that, but I'll leave with that. You know, thank you for everything you've done, and you've, you know, contributed so much just by talking to us and telling other victims out there that, you know, there's a place you can go. You can call your law firm. And also I want to give a shout out to Ross, your partner down at, it's Ross, is it Leonidakis?
Leonidakis, yes.
Leonidakis was the first one that contacted me, and, you know, everything you said matched what he said, especially about Watchtower's documents being highly redacted. Yeah, I know you guys, you know, these things, they sound like a lot of money, those awards, and they are, but the work that goes into it, both before, during, and after, is people have no idea how much work goes into these cases, and the blood, sweat, and toil that you guys went through. And also Jim Malloy, I think, up in Montana, you know,
Yes.
who was your Montana attorney. Terrific guys, did a great job. You know, thanks for everything. And, you know, love to hear any further comments that you have on this, but thank you for everything.
And Javi, your thoughts in wrapping up?
Sure. So on the Netherlands, on the stuff that's going on in the Netherlands, I just want to say, you know, thanks to your work from people like Neil, we know Watchtower is a, you know, $1.5 billion corporation. That kind of money buys you a lot of lawyers, a lot of expertise, a lot of power, a lot of clout. So when we look at things like what's going on in the Netherlands, we usually expect, as a former journalist, we expect that there's going to be some huge case and a giant watershed moment, and that there's going to be a point of time after that moment where things are just going to be different. The reality is that it's more like a little trickle that leads to a creek, that leads to a river, that leads out to the ocean, and things are probably going to build up that way. But we're starting to see that in the Netherlands. We're starting to see not just civil litigation, we're starting to see criminal cases, and just a combined effort of all those things. I think hopefully we'll start seeing Watchtower being spurred into changing their policies, their doctrine, or some kind of action, at the very least justice for some of the victims. About the quick discussion we talked about, Mark talked about in the news with the arson fires in the state of Washington. as someone like everyone on here who speaks out against Watchtower abuses, I think when stuff like this happens, it's equally as important to speak out against those things. I, for one, and all of you, I'm sure, do too. I have family who are still Jehovah's Witnesses, who I deeply, deeply care about and I love. And I personally would hate to see them impacted by, an act of violence like that. So it's important that we speak out against Watchtower, but it's equally important that we say something when stuff like this happens, because that's not cool. That's very dangerous, and people can get hurt, and nobody wants to see that. And then regarding the cases that we discussed, Neil, I have like a billion questions, and I know this doesn't have this forum. We have a time limit, but it's very, very true. We owe you a couple beers. I don't know if you drink, but you're definitely owed some beers. And I could pick your brain for 2 or 3 hours if you ever have a chance. Lloyd, you guys, we're all working on another film. So if we can ever set that up, let's do that. And good luck on your next marathon. I can see from.
Thank you, sir.
The stuff in your background there.
Javi is multitasking at this point. We're cross-pollinating with projects. So
listen, I don't get a lot of airtime, so I got to take advantage of my time over here. Okay. So thank you for your efforts. Please stay motivated and keep helping us out. It's invaluable to us, and I certainly appreciate it. And I'm sure there's thousands and thousands of former Jehovah's Witnesses that feel like every time you win a case, a little bit of justice is served, and hopefully, things will change. So please keep doing your work, and we appreciate it greatly. That's it. That's my wrap up.
Neil, I think it's safe to say that not enough has been said about what you achieved in Montana, what you and your associates achieved. It was a monumental decision. It brought to light abuse that isn't understood well enough. And if it were fully understood, I believe we will be seeing more raids, such as, the police action that we've seen in Holland. If child sex abuse is going to be treated with the seriousness that it deserves, it should just be stopped by the government, and the government should intervene. But a lot of people watching this will be wanting to pick your brains, as Javi just said, and wanting more details to compensate for the fact that so little has been said. So we're very grateful that you've been able to share what you've been able to share. If there's anyone watching this video who is concerned about the child sex abuse issue, if there are any victims who are watching this who are uncertain as to how to proceed further, what would be your message to them?
So the message I'd want them to know is contact legal counsel, and contact them now. Don't let that deadline run. I know you guys have shared my firm, which is Nix Patterson, on the web at nixlaw.com. And I'm here for anybody that wants to contact me. And I appreciate Lloyd, you and Mark and Javier, you helping out. I did not accomplish this case in Montana. I mean, that case in Montana was accomplished because of the facts of the case. And my job was simply to boil it down to its essence and present it in a clear, concise way. And I did that with the help of Jim Malloy, who's our Montana lawyer, who's a brilliant legal mind and is still helping us with the case. And Ross Leonidakis from my office, who that was his first trial. So he got a good result for his first trial. The other thing that I would want people to know is that if you're a victim, or if you're somebody that you're just trying to research this, or you're another author that's writing about this, is that these are not isolated events. These are not random mistakes that are happening in the Jehovah's Witness Church. This is happening because of a plan or policy. And that is the news story that should be out there. You guys are the ones that are telling this case. If it weren't for the help of Lloyd reading your book and Mark discovering your website, I would have received the first answers in the case that I got from the church. And it would have said, there's no documents, you can't have them because they say this, and we did nothing wrong. And I would have said, oh, okay, man, maybe I don't have a very good case. But because of the information that you guys had gathered and shared, I was able to find out, oh, hey, there's some documents that came out in another case. And Mark's got those up on his website. Lloyd's written about them. And then I benefited from the help of other lawyers that worked on cases like the Connie case and the Fessler case that said, hey, Neil, let me share what I know. You need to read this. You need to ask about that. And through this collective community, that's how we were able to be successful with this case. So Javier, in response to your question, I love working on cases like this. I can talk about them all day. And my hope is that by sharing this information, I'm giving back for the person that has the next case that calls me up and says, hey, I'm stuck here, and I can say you need to ask about this and that to get down to the truth of this.
Well, if it's difficult to imagine, but it would be nice if Watchtower had some of your modesty. That's for sure. But really lovely words. Thank you, Neil. It is a team effort. We're all doing our part, but bottom line, when the chips were down and you needed to bring your football to the game, you did that, and we're very grateful for that. And thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come on here and talk to us.
Anytime.
So viewers, you have been watching episode 18 of Watchtower in Focus. Please don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more episodes. But for now, thank you so much for watching.